Hi everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides. I'm your host, Jed Brown, founder of Low Season Traveller, and this episode is taken from the 7th session of the Keeping the Dream Alive series of webinars, which we're collaborating on with the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage and My Travel Research. This 7th episode is entitled Aviation in Crisis. And it's fair to say that for the most part, tourism starts with airlift. While many of us are not directly involved in aviation, we're all too aware that our livelihoods depend on it in tourism terms. Put simply, whatever happens in aviation will affect the rest of the travel and tourism ecostructure further downstream. As such, this morning's speaker is going to help us to understand exactly how aviation has been affected by the current crisis and what it will take to recover to previous levels. And there's literally no one better to help us unpick this than today's keynote speaker, John Grant of Midas Aviation. John has worked at the cutting edge of aviation for over 30 years, having spent time with KLM, OAG, ASM and latterly with Midas Aviation. He's a hugely well-respected veteran of the industry, regularly provides commentary on the industry for media such as Sky, BBC and others, and he thought he'd seen it all until we hit March this year. Today, John works with airports, tourism boards, airlines and a variety of other partners in order to help them to attract, retain and grow their air services. We used to call it route development, but perhaps these days it's now known as route protection. This is the Q&A from John's keynote speech. Enjoy. Thank you so much. That was a lot. There's a lot to unpick there, and it was look that was fascinating. I mean, one of the sort of the themes that we've seen there is, I think we're saying that the aviation industry, for the most part, has been, in many cases, falsely inflated for quite some time, right? And are we just paying the price of the fact that it has been falsely inflated for so long?
It was it was certainly a great market as a traveller in terms of available capacity and supply. We had probably created artificial markets that just from a realistic long-term perspective were unsustainable. When you look at an airline's network and you list all of the destinations, there will always be at the bottom of that list maybe 5 or 10% that the airline is focused on and is at risk. We had allowed that to grow and grow. The leasing of aircraft became relatively cheap. The barriers to entry were almost non-existent in this globalized world. It has been relatively easy to start an airline. And on that basis, what we've seen, of course, is new airlines, new entrants, all of these sort of things. So probably we've seen too many people, too many airlines, too much capacity, and we've probably been spoiled, and the world has changed a bit, I think.
Do you think though that there's an expectation, both within the industry and actually with the consumers as well, that we need to be working to return back to those old days? Which what we're saying is that as a result of COVID, it's been exposed for what it is. Having false route economics, as well as I suppose a false sense of security with regards to the travel industry. Is it right for us to aspire to get back to that, or should we actually be looking at a new world order of aviation? Is it right to be bailing out it's linked to one of the questions, and we'll move on to the listeners' questions. Is it right to be bailing out the likes of Virgin Atlantic? Because you sort of think, well, if they're not profitable and they're going to go bust, then that's the capitalist world that we live in. That's what happens. But of course, there is the other side of this, which is, for example, the Caribbean. That's going to massively affect their tourism economies as a result of this. Is it right that we keep supporting these airlines which are failing, and they're failing for good reason?
Well, there's a load of questions there. If you were restarting the airline industry, you wouldn't start it from where we are today. in terms of a mix of public and private owned entities competing quite often against each other in the same markets. It makes for unfair competition on occasions. The issue about whether we should be bailing those airlines out is absolutely central to the situation we face at the moment. And my personal opinion is that we shouldn't be bailing them out. You know, they should have behaved like good businesses, respecting shareholders, building up cash reserves. They shouldn't have been doing things that strategically, you know, everyone looked at it and said, why on earth are you trying to do this, or why are you doing that? And we shouldn't be picking on Virgin Atlantic in this discussion. Why on earth did you suddenly start Virgin, Little Red, or whatever it was, their UK domestic network, paying a huge lease price to Aer Lingus when everyone knew that you would never compete against British Airways frequent flyer program and the brand loyalty that BA had on the domestic trunk routes? Absolutely stupid, absolutely poor decision by that business. You know, why did they fly a very fragmented long-haul network? The clue was in their original name, Virgin Atlantic. That's where they should have stuck to. That was their strength. That's where their brand existed. But there are airlines that you could do create exactly the same discussion around. Thai International at the moment are heading into bankruptcy, from what I can see, you know, and they've been saved many times. So I think for many airlines, Jed, they confused being cash generative with being profitable. And you know, that is a very, very big difference. And many have been slow to respond to the changing world in which we live in. You know, ancillary revenue incomes have been, for many airlines, still not developed, and they could have. So you know, there's a lot of things that are wrong in the industry that this gives an opportunity to sort out.
One of the sort of the points on this that, you know, that came across from your presentation, and you know, we've heard it from a few different sources now, is, look, you know, when we come out of this, you know, it's pretty certain there are going to be fewer commercial airlines in the world as a result of this. Do you foresee that is going to have an impact on the prices for flights? That, you know, I know at the end there you were sort of saying, you know, prices could come down, people might want to travel more than ever. If there's going to be fewer airlines around, is that an opportunity for those airlines to, you know, to increase the prices accordingly?
Well, I think one of the great challenges we have, Jed, is that, as it's just mentioned, the barriers to entry are much lower than they used to be. So if we see demand picking up, there's probably thousands of aircraft around the world that will be sitting on pieces of tarmac somewhere that have not been put back into service by existing airlines that will be available for new carriers. So I can see a situation where we will see failures, we will see airline collapses in the next couple of months, and stretching into early next year, because they will not have built the cash reserves up. But there will be other entrepreneurs out there with liquidity and with cash who will see an opportunity to start new airlines, with no debt attached to that entity, and with lease rates currently 30 to 40% below what they have been at the beginning of the year. You know, this is a supply and demand market, and as demand rebuilds, those airlines who've run out of cash reserves may well collapse, but there is equally a high possibility that we will see some new entrants enter the market. And you know, we may actually see some changes in ownership. So we see people who previously could not start an airline in an overseas country being invited to start that airline.
There could be some quite interesting opportunities. This was linked to some of our questions. I'll start moving on to some of our questions here. As you can see, I'm on a very small screen, so I'm having to squint. Apologies for that. Let me get our first question, which was Enzo Zangrilli from Italy. Good morning, guys. John, Jed, a comment, please, on your Prime Minister's 14-day quarantine. Is it still on? Is it not something totally dissonant from any other country's decision on the subject? This 14-day quarantine period, you touched on it in your presentation, John. This is for the UK have. I'm not familiar with what's going on with Australia and New Zealand, although I think there will be similar kind of quarantines. But we, as you were pointed out there, John, we were told that France was excluded from the quarantine. I think the latest is that the Republic of Ireland has been excluded from the quarantine, which presumably means that you could fly out on your vacation, assuming you're able to, out of Dublin, come back from Dublin, hop over on Ryanair to Manchester or London, and you wouldn't have to be in quarantine. Is that about the height of it?
Yeah, that is about the height of it.
Okay.
To answer Enzo's question, I mean, it's as bad an idea as his piano playing is, but that's
Oh, come on, his piano playing is very good.
But I think it just, if you are an airline CEO and you are sitting in your office trying to plan your way out of this event, and you either fly from the United Kingdom or fly to the United Kingdom, and it's a large part of your network. 2 weeks ago, you were told that, or 10 days ago, you were told that there would be a quarantine. 24 hours after that, you were told that the Republic of Ireland and France would be excluded from that. And yesterday, some government minister said, well, we might actually have some selected countries that we would have corridors where travel would be permitted. How can you plan your business on that basis? How can you put schedules and services back in to operate? It is by any stretch of the imagination an unworkable strategy. And there are two people who I have the utmost respect for from either end of the aviation spectrum: Michael O'Leary at Ryanair and Willie Walsh from IAG. And it might just be their country of origin, but they tell it as they see it. And Michael O'Leary said you couldn't even police such a policy in the United Kingdom because you do not have enough government officials to check on whether people are adhering to the quarantine requirements that are going to be put in place. It is incomprehensible. And for an island that is dependent on air service and was in the top 5 global markets for capacity, to have a quarantine requirement is just madness. We don't have one now. Why would we have one when everyone else is building out?
Well, I think they're unpoliced as well, aren't they? I think it's you're asked to go into quarantine. So I know early on in the crisis, there's a few countries which had this, which you were asked to go into quarantine, and I think New Zealand, Australia, they were all there. I have access to a lot of the forward keys data, and I was seeing that there were still trips that are being booked, and they're still being booked today. Just so everybody knows, there are still passengers on flights, and people were booking trips for New York to London for 3 days. Returning 3 days later. Well, obviously they're not going to quarantine themselves for 14 days when they're only over for 3 days to begin with. So
that's absolutely not. And a one-day business trip to Spain at the moment for a UK or a Spanish national would require a 28-day quarantine period.
It's just ridiculous.
14 days at either end of the route to complete one day's business. It just goes to show the lack of understanding amongst politicians about the importance of air service and how the market works. And these are apparently our elected representatives. It drives me to distraction.
It needs a reality check. Sorry, John, could I just ask you? I have just realised. Could you turn on your camera just so we can see you? I hadn't realised that you weren't on camera. Yeah, sorry, thanks.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Oh, thanks, John. Another point on, and again, we sort of touched on this, and I listened to a podcast recently, and I'm sure people listen to different podcasts all the time, about what the future of aviation will be like in terms of the airport experience. So obviously after 9/11, we had the formation of the TSA, we've got all of the security and the extra security checks, and there's been sort of murmurs now about, before you even go on the airport grounds, you're going to have to be, tested for COVID-19 and all of this kind of stuff, and social distancing. So a couple of points I just want to unpick on that. Social distancing at the moment, we're being told that you need to be 2 meters away from anybody else. That requires an individual footprint of 16 meters squared. Are there any airports in the world that are big enough for that? Is this whole, even the social distancing, is this Is this just unrealistic completely for aviation to be able to have this social distancing?
Completely unrealistic. I mean, take any major airport that has a series of wide-bodied aircraft departing within a 1 hour or 2 hour window, and have reasonably high load factors, 50% plus, then we're going to have queuing in excess of a mile and a half, I think was Heathrow's estimation. And it's just not going to work. It is just like, please think about the whole situation. There are so many ironies around all of this. At a time when the industry is contracting, when we're seeing less capacity, less passengers, we're actually imposing on airports a requirement to create more space and to distance people more than they ever have been before. And I completely and utterly understand the sentiment, but the practicalities of it are just not possible. And maybe it is about this confidence and reassurance. Do we put sanitizing hand wash dispensers by every air bridge, so that once a person's got to that point in the process, they can wash their hands again and cleanse themselves that way? No, it's not possible. There isn't an airport in the world that is going to be able to cope with that requirement yet.
Yeah, we're just going to have to accept that there is a risk.
Yeah, we are, but we've got to put this in context. If you look at, in my own area, if you look at the population around where I live, and you look at the number of incidences of COVID-19, and that we would consider ourselves a normal type of community with a normal demographic, we're talking about 0.0024% of people that have been impacted. And as every government minister tells me, a death is an unfortunate incident. I completely get that, but the death of a global economy, and it's all about risk, isn't it? And I think we've got to get beyond that point and start to rebuild confidence.
Absolutely. Another question here. I think we've pretty much covered it, but I'll read it out. This was from Mark Taylor. Not sure if John will get to this. If Virgin are bailed out, will the updated carrier be more likely to join one of the global alliances?
If Virgin gets bailed out, Virgin are quasi in an alliance anyway, aren't they? They are part of SkyTeam through their Delta ownership, and they do many things that are consistent with what Delta would want them to do, rather than what perhaps Virgin would want to do themselves. As I understand it, all of their back office systems are now Delta's. Who calls the shots on the slots at Heathrow? I'm sure Delta have a considerable influence on that. The value of Virgin Atlantic is not in the brand, because in the last 3 months, their reputation has been shot in the UK. Public goodwill has been, severely flowing against them. It's in those slots that they have at Heathrow. And 4 months ago, they were trading at about $20 million a pair. Now they're probably not even a third of that value until the uncertainty is removed from the market. But over time, that value will rebuild, and they've got the historic rights. So that the value of the Virgin Atlantic business is in the slots rather than the brand. And someone asked me, would Virgin survive? And I said, I really don't know. All I can tell you is the capacity will be there. If they are not there, someone will come
fill it.
Yeah.
This was from Dale Lawrence. In the 2016 at the party conference in Auckland, John predicted the demise of the A380. We were talking about this off there before. Are other aircraft types now at risk of imminent obsolescence? So I suppose this comes on to this point. There's when we're looking at a new world like this in terms of aviation, where are the opportunities and threats for the different aircraft types as well?
Well, if you're a fan of a 747-400 and you can find a flight that's still scheduled and you want to do it quickly, because it's not going to be around for much longer.
Really?
Yeah, the 747-400 series was already becoming quite quite a rare beast. Lufthansa had a fleet, and British Airways have got a fleet, and there are a couple of other carriers out there with some. But I can see that being retired. Many airlines like BA and Lufthansa already had publicly announced the retirement schedules for those fleets. They're going to be accelerated forward. They're not going to come back. So that's definitely a goner. Americans got rid of the MD-80, and that's not going to come back. Certainly not for American. And probably Delta's made some plans around a 767, so that's not going to be around in their fleet. All of which plays to that point I was making earlier. There's going to be a lot of spare aircraft around, that if someone sees a gap in the market and has no debt and can start from scratch and can build a new business model and doesn't have to worry about pensions and all of the things that many airlines are burdened with at this moment in time, it could strangely enough be a good time to think about a new airline. But and even Tim Clark at Emirates has said, the A380 is history. Dal, I was right. Sadly, it's not the right aircraft for the right time.
Yeah, that's a shame. Will Emirates, this is from Andrew Denishensky, will Emirates and Qatar be looking at a similar setup to the Emirates Qantas partnership, which effectively bailed out Qantas? Is this essentially what BA have in place with Qatar?
I think there is. If you look at the Emirates network and you look at Dubai and what has happened there over the last 40 years, it's been a phenomenal success story. The creation of a mega city out of the desert and all the visionary plans that they have delivered on. But within the UAE, I think the question is, does the market need 2 national carriers or even 3 national carriers if you include Sharjah? Within United Arab Emirates, no, it probably doesn't. Does it need 3 major airfields within a 1-hour drive time of each other, 2 of which have little or minimal use, and that's DWC and Abu Dhabi? The answer is no, they probably don't. Would they be better with 1 merged entity? Yes. Why has it not happened? That's a thing called pride that has prevented it from happening. But if you were going to do it, now would be a good time to do it. And I think Qatar have got their own challenges where they are.
Will the potential, this one's from Mark Taylor, will the potential passenger concerns re health and increased time spent in airports lead to increased use of private jets and perhaps also increase in demand for flights out of smaller airports such as London City?
That's a good question. Private jet movements over the last couple of weeks have been significantly up on previous years. And there's a growing awareness that they can be quite price competitive. Use of secondary airports depends on what the government requirements are on screening processes, and whether those airports continue to survive. In the United Kingdom, there are many regional airports that are, now with the demise of Flybe, which occurred before COVID-19 had really started. Many of those airports were 90% plus dependent on Flybe for their aeronautical revenues, and that's not been replaced. And we've lived without those services for 3.5 months. And it's going to be harder for those services to be restarted after a gap of that amount of time. I know we've been in lockdown, but people will just either turn to the train or perhaps even take private car. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic that we have playing out at this moment in time.
Yep. Chris, Carolyn, do you want to come on? Have you got any questions from your side? Hey. Chris, did you have any questions that came through on your side?
Well, one of the things that was when I was listening to John and just some of the sort of the dynamics that are happening or the confusion that's happening within the industry. There are so many small things that need to be considered. I mean, what happens with boarding passes and e-tickets? Is everything on your phone from now on?
I think
You
so.
can't be passing these on anymore.
Yeah,
it has to be, doesn't it, John?
I think so, Chris. I think biometrics are going to be a fascinating area of development.
Yeah.
You know, your own personal passport. There was been speculation about, you know, inserting a microchip under your skin that's got all your sort of personal details in your bank account, passport, etc. All potential solutions. I mean, this will accelerate the automation of travel, no doubt about that. Be that from, you know, just baggage drop-off facilities through to clearing, security, boarding. You know, you can imagine a situation where, for those who are lucky enough or unlucky enough still to get fed on an aeroplane, someone heats your meal up in a kitchen, puts it in a box, and you go and you get a message comes up on your IFE screen that tells you your meal's ready to go and pick up at the catering booth. You know, because all of that personality and all of those touch points apparently are going to be removed or could be removed. What I would say is that as human beings, we forget things very quickly. You know, the hysteria, the natural reaction to 911 was of concern. Everyone moved past that within about 6 months. Typically, the industry bounces back between 9 and 12 months later. You look at the curve and it's where it would have been. This might take a bit longer.
It's quite interesting. You know, I was looking at those timelines that you were talking about. You know, 2021, 22, etc. And on the presentation that I made a couple of weeks ago, I was referring back to SARS, 2003, and of course SARS lasted for what, 2 months, less than 800 deaths, and yet it took the industry, the aviation industry, about a year to recover. So the reality of all of this, and then of course factoring into this equation the work that ICAO has to do in terms of policy and the various different practices, this is a bloody minefield. You know, it's muddling through is one way to describe it right now, but it's so confused.
Completely. And, you know, even just so many levels. There are many flight deck crew that, if we are not careful, will, under current rules and regulations, need to revalidate before they can actually operate a commercial flight. Unless someone issues dispensations, you know, everyone from cabin staff to flight deck are going to have to do familiarization flights, and you can't do them all in a simulator. You've got to do them in an aircraft, and if you're going to do them in an aircraft, these airlines are going to have to spend more money getting their people back up to speed. Now, the UKCAA, I understand, has issued a dispensation, but, you know, that's got to be done on a global basis. And there are airfields in the world where, you know, because of their peculiarities and operating restrictions, some flight decks need to fly regularly to maintain their license for that airport. So we've got things at that very simple level that need to be put back in place. Air traffic controllers, you know, they've all been furloughed. We've got to find them and get them back on working as well.
Going to take a while.
It hadn't crossed my mind before, John, but you know, when you look at COVID-19 and the incubation period, you know, they say it's 2 weeks. In fact, they now know that it can live in the nose for probably up to 3 weeks. Just looking at the social distancing of a tech crew in a cockpit, how's that going to work? It's, you know, it's really quite amazing. You can test one person one day, and the following day they could be positive.
Absolutely. Which, Chris, which interestingly was the first response from the UK government's chief medical officer when quizzed on that particular point. Said there is no value in airport screening because someone could walk through with a clean bill of health and not present symptoms for another 13 days. But now the chief medical officer and our elected representatives are saying that we now need to have quarantine. How do you square that circle?
Yeah.
You can't, can you? It's I think a lot of it, you alluded to it before, John. It's just going to be about the perception of it, and it's just about I think a lot of it seems to be that people are just going to have to feel more secure and safe. But like you say, there isn't an insurance policy in the world that's going to cover anybody for anything to do with coronavirus or any strain of a coronavirus ever again. Therefore, I think there's just going to have to be an acceptance across everybody that there is a risk, hopefully quite a small risk, but there is a risk. But you can't avoid it. And like they say, we've been living with coronaviruses, strains of it, for at the very least 17 years. So I guess it's just going to be a part of the new normal, new abnormal, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, and we'll get past it. The industry does. It's amazingly. If other industries showed the amount of resilience and creativity that the aviation sector showed, the world would be in a pretty good place.
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Carolyn?
I did, but I suspect it might throw a cat among the pigeons, which is I think a number of epidemiologists might well disagree with you. And we've actually had a calculation done of the benefit of the lockdown to the Australian economy, taking into account both the losses and the gains. And we're $20 billion better off for having a lockdown, which is a pretty unarguable number. So I don't pretend to understand all the detail myself, but I think when you say it's unarguable, I would like to just say, well, maybe we need more than one kind of opinion on that. And we're all from an aviation background. We look at it through the lens of our world and our space. Australia and New Zealand do have lockdowns. We need permission to fly overseas, and you must self-quarantine for 2 weeks if you come here. It's not been 100% effective, but it's been widely supported and widely used. So I think we probably do need to be aware there's a wider dialogue that we sit within on that. And I'd be really interested to have views in the chat box from other people on what their thoughts are on some of that. And I think one of the things that's confused people around this is probabilities, which is any individual measure on its own looks stupid, but every measure that's been recommended or taken has been looked on playing the percentages. So it's incredibly stupid that 20 people can go, 30 people can go to a funeral here in Australia, but only 10 people can get together for anything else. But when you look at the percentages of that and set it against the emotional impact of someone being able to attend a funeral, you can see why that apparent inconsistency sets up. So I'm just playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, I guess, for a moment.
It's good to have a devil in the room, but what you're saying is right, and everything should be considered in a rounded context. And the biggest, I empathise with people in many respects because we're dealing with an unknown, aren't we? Whereas when there's a terrorist attack, it's a horrible situation and it's an event, but people can respond in a particular way and authorities can respond in a particular way because they have seen that type of event before and know how to handle it. Whereas this is an unknown, but it's the consistency of messaging, not just in one country, but across countries, that is very, very important to maintain confidence, not just in aviation, but just confidence in society.
I suspect that's part of the reason why it may have worked better in Australia and New Zealand than it did in the UK, John, is that there were two changes in that message. One, when only flights from China were set off, and then the second was that everyone was self-quarantine at one time, and that has remained in place. So it hasn't been, I think that's where we see it. But I think you've definitely got a lot of support from people in the room. In fact, one of the questions was around, I'm just clicking down to have a look at it now, was how do we knock some sense into the politicians?
Good question. We don't. I mean, what frustrates me more than anything, I think, is the woeful response of the industry's trade associations in all parts of the world, from IATA to ICAO to the Airport Operators Association in the United Kingdom, whoever it happens to be, PARTA, whoever it happens to be. Sorry, Dow. Just there is, God, we've lacked leadership. God, we've lacked anyone, taking the initiative and trying to bring people together and get a consensus. This thing happened 3.5 months, 4 months ago, and ICAO is still working out what its guidelines are going to be. What did they do for the first 7 or 8 weeks of this event? Watch it, wonder what was going on, self-isolate at home. It just, and some of the sound bites from IATA, you think you need to, unless they're doing really good lobbying behind the scenes, in which case it's not working. It's just let us all down so badly.
Another question we've had, John, and this has come up on a few previous webinars, but I think it may be easier for you to answer this than some of the previous speakers, which is the whole issue of airfares and what's going to happen to airfares going forward if we are having to fly at these kind of capacity levels on aircraft.
Well, at the moment, when we look at forward booking data, so there's lots of companies, Skyscanner, Forward Keys, 3 Victors, who track forward fares and movements in fares. We're seeing no movement in fares whatsoever, either up or down. Now, in truth, they don't have much scope to go down, particularly in Europe when you factor in airport charges and you factor in environmental taxes and all of the other taxes. The net fare to the airline sometimes are no more than 10 or 12 pounds in Europe, and they make more of their revenue from ancillaries. Jet2's ancillary revenue per passenger last year was about 37 pounds, which is more than their average yield. So what we are seeing is airlines waiving restrictions. So whereas previously you bought a relatively cheap fare, you couldn't change your flight, whatever, you've now got flexibility to do that. I've heard that it's, if you buy a fare on Delta and American for January at a really cheap fare and you manage to change a reservation and go in July when it's normally the high season, lucky you. But of course airlines are trying to generate cash. Long term, airfares will stay about where they are. I can't see a really significant spike in airfares because, to the point I was saying to Jed, if the market bounces back and we do see strong demand and airlines do collapse, others will fill that gap. The barriers to entry are so low now.
Cool.
The thing about that, though, John, to some degree, I was just going to say, we have a pandemic here, but we also have an economic crisis as well. So many people have lost their jobs, so many people are out of work. So there's going to be not so much pent-up demand, but pent-up aspiration to travel. That has to be factored into a carrier's thinking as well. It's not going to come back. So do you think there'll be mass discounting like we've seen in previous years? And if so, how long do you think that will last?
Yeah, it will last undoubtedly, Chris, because if you think about it, we're now middle of May, peak Northern Hemisphere travel period is late June through to second week of September. Airlines are sitting with 20% of the bookings, maybe 30% of the bookings they had this time last year. They need to get cash in. We're going to be in a short phase of cash generation. Revenue generation for the airlines is going to be absolutely vital. So we're going to be seeing some stunning fares for the first couple of weeks. And that in itself is going to be a real challenge for airlines and revenue management, because traditionally, you'd sell all of your cheap fares in the 6 months, 9 months out, and 2 weeks before travel, you'd be looking to sell to a businessman at 4, 5, 6 times what the leisure passenger was paying. The leisure passenger, because of all of these restrictions and all of these uncertainties, isn't going to be booking until 2 weeks before travel, when they feel comfortable enough looking forward that there is still going to be no restrictions in place. So we're going to be seeing a clash of the leisure booking profile shortening against the business. So from an airline's perspective and from a hotelier's perspective, revenue managing your stock is going to become a little bit more complex for the next couple of months.
Lots of questions about the future specifically of LCCs, and even one from Tony Hallwood asking about whether this is a time to start up a new LCC given aircraft lease rates and oil prices.
Oh, Hallwood Air, I can see it now. Yeah, as I say, this is bizarrely, for anyone who's, if you bet on the market and you got it right, and you've got lots of cash, now's the time to start an airline. Plenty of slots at Gatwick. You don't have to go to Stansted. There's lots of opportunity around the world for low-cost airlines. If you get the business model right, and you don't have those pensions, those built-up costs, all of those overheads, and you've got flexible working conditions for your staff and all of these sort of things, and there's a lot of qualified pilots who are going to be looking for jobs in the next couple of months. Now's the time to go for it. There's enough gaps in the market that could be filled.
So there you have it. Huge thanks again to John Grant for his insights this week, and if you haven't already done so, do have a listen to the keynote from this session in the previous episode, also out now. That's all for now. Enjoy your day, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home, and don't forget that our content will always be free for everyone, as we believe that travel is better without the crowds.